I want to talk about something which is close to my personal experience and very difficult to summarize in just a short lecture this morning. But I hope it will inspire you, as Professor Iwo mentioned in relation to him and his own studies. Perhaps you will want to study this subject more because I think it is important to think about. I call it Chi or HCI in sci-fi, or you could think about it as die Geschichte der Zukunft, the HCI, the history of the future of HCI. I'm going to talk a little bit about the taxonomies of HCI and sci-fi, and then I will show you some examples from cinema and a few from video over the last 100 years of science fiction. Many of you have enjoyed these films. How many of you have read science fiction as a child or as an adult? Whoa! Okay. Whoa. Very interesting. So I'll ask for your help in case I forget some details. I only had a short time to prepare this lecture, not like the 3 months we have spent working on our 4 machines, the green machine, the health machine, the money machine, and the memory machine for mobile products. You can find out about them at our website or LinkedIn or Facebook. So, people have been thinking about the future for a long time. The earliest I could find is Roger Bacon from 1,000 years ago, imagining flying machines which would take people through the air. This was 200 or 300 years before Da Vinci showed those famous drawings of flying machines. Now, my contact with sci-fi began in the 1950s. Maybe you know some of these publications. I read them as a child. The Galaxy, If, Astounding, and so on. They had a very optimistic vision of the future. When the world wasn't being destroyed, it was going to be a wonderful new place with robots and rocket ships and flying cars and so on. That influenced me as a child long ago, as George Lucas said, in the galaxy long ago and far away, in Omaha, Nebraska, where I was born, in the middle of the United States. I made my first rocket ship control panel. I did not realize it, but I was doing HCI design. Who knew? That is my late brother, Stephen, modeling the space helmet, which I designed. It was only cardboard and a light bulb, but in our imagination, it was perfect. I had a special name for my machine. I called it a radical hydroscopic lunar dimensional superspectrum sinusoidal tabulating operating system communication radio. For short, I called it the Google machine. It even influenced my drawing. I love drawing rocket ships, spacemen and spacewomen, flying machines, robots, and so on. That is where I came from in studying HCI and sci-fi. Now, in 1992, I was invited by Kai to create a panel of science fiction authors to come and talk about the future of HCI. I had by accident a conversation with William Gibson on a talk radio show in 1982 or 3 or 4. But in 1992, he couldn't come, but Bruce Sterling could come. Maybe some of you know his name. He's very smart and very funny. And they all talked about crazy ideas of the future. It was so popular that Kai asked me to stage it again in 1999, and that's where I ask everyone on the panel to wear these hats, to be aliens in the world of Chi, and to imagine the future. You know more about the taxonomy of HCI, thinking about hardware and software, thinking about the metaphors, mental models, navigation, interaction, appearance, paradigms. You're studying this and thinking about it all the time. You know it is quite complex. So also is the taxonomy of sci-fi, of storytelling, the genre, the storytelling arc or narrative, what kind of technology is used, or whether it emphasizes high-tech or not, what view of society, what view of time, of the future, or crossing time, what discussion of cultures, future culture, like the influence of Russian culture and the Russian jargon in A Clockwork Orange, remember? It was so influential in that situation. Or the approaches to hardware, software, and the particular medium of storytelling. If you were to cross these two taxonomies, you would have a 9x9 matrix. So many possible things to study and think about. It would keep many PhD students busy for the next 10 years. And I hope some people will decide to study exactly this. I'm going to make a very eclectic and personal selection of some of the films I've selected here to show a few of the HCI topics in those films. I don't know if you've ever given attention to that. The challenge in the movies is that you actually have to show rocket ships and control panels and everything, which the author can mention a little and describe something of, but doesn't have to fill out the whole background. But in the video or in the TV, you see everything, and you want to know, what is that they're playing with over there? Or what is this over here? And someone has to design that or invent it and produce it and show it. So it makes for some very interesting humor and mistakes and also invention. So when you look at these images, think about who are the users, what kind of control panels are we looking at, what about the culture diversity or even species diversity? Remember, these are alien computer interfaces also, not just human. Hardware, information visualization, the use of speech and audio, gesture. And what about user-centered design? So important to all of us here in this room. I'll have something to say about that. And transparency, visual displays. What seems futuristic? What view do they have of the past? What view do they have of the future? What are some ideas about gender differences or gender relationships? Some of them are quite curious in their approach to that. What attitudes about people and machines emerge? And what positive or negative views of technology? So here are some examples I'm going to show you from the first 50 years or so of film and a little bit of TV for science fiction. And then we'll move to later times. Some of the earliest films that were created in the late 19th century came from Georges Méliès from France. Some of the earliest of these films were sort of sci-fi movies. It wasn't exactly sci-fi. Some kind of a machine turned pigs into pork, and that was supposed to be somewhat magical. Perhaps you know better A Trip to the Moon from 1902, in which a rocket ship lands in the face of the man of the moon, and it was a very innovative use of animation and superimposed imagery in films, which was still quite new at the time. Also, you may know 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which was one of the first color films, and also deals with a kind of science fiction theme. One of the films somewhat later that you may well know is Fritz Lang's Metropolis. It was one of the most expensive films ever made. I think in US dollars now about $130 million was spent on it. And it featured robots. It featured some new ideas about communication. Look, here in 1927 is an image of a television being used. This is about 20 years before the first commercial television shows in the United States. Maybe they appeared earlier somewhere, but I know them from the US history. And here is a robot, a female robot. But many of the machines, as you see in the background here, are traditional lever mechanical controls. This is supposed to be far into the future, but it was still parked very securely back in 1927 in most of the controls. By the way, in most of these films, I cannot go into the discussion of Marx and Engels and capitalism versus socialism. There's so many rich themes of culture and society. Those are part of the narrative arc of each of the films. I don't have time. I'm only going to focus or call your attention on a few of the HCI qualities. A little later, many of you may have seen some early Flash Gordon films. Once again, in 1936, still 10 years ahead of commercial television, is a wall TV, similar to what is shown decades later in 2001. Similar kind of technology, but this is appearing in 1936. That's impressive. Of course, the techniques of rocket ships and so on were rather ancient in those days of film. It was always funny to see the rocket ships floating through space with the smoke going up from the rocket ship because it was some chemical burning in a small model of a rocket held by a little wire while they photographed it. Here is 1941. This is one of about 7, I think, maybe 17 films created featuring Superman. In this case, these are evil robots that Superman has to battle. I happen to show it because this particular film was featured again or influential in Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow, if you happen to know that film. That film was created by one person on a PC, a film on a PC, and later famous Hollywood actors like Gwyneth Paltrow and I can't quite hear. Jude Law, yes, of course. My wife is in love with him. So maybe that's why I forgot it. Jude Law, yes. So they were in green rooms in front of the imagery. They had no idea what was going on in the background, but it's quite an impressive movie, and it used some of the same kind of scenes and same themes from this movie. In video, I was myself as a child very influenced by Captain Video. I don't know if you know his name, and another program called Tom Orbit Space Cadets that would fly off to other planets. My brother and I told stories at bedtime to each other about flying off onto other worlds. I remember in those days, you can even see here, I think, that the sets were quite simple. And in one Captain Video episode, they're made out of cardboard and a few fake knobs and pieces of cardboard. The Captain Video, or one of his people, accidentally hit the control panel, and the entire control panel fell over. Remember, this was during live TV, no videotape. The actor picked up the control panel and put it against the wall and turned to his colleagues and to the camera and said, "Oh, it's good no wires were broken." Those were very charming days. In 1967, I don't know if any of you have ever seen this terrible little movie called Journey to the Center of Time. I don't know, it was a science fiction film directed by David Hewitt, starring people you never heard of. And what is interesting, though, in the film, is look again at this background. Where have we seen that before? Well, almost since, in a way, Fritz Lang, but in Captain Video, in many of the images of the time, these kind of large-scale flashing lights backgrounds were what movie makers thought of as command and control and the necessary instruments. And I think it's interesting that even here for this conference, we see the same kind of imagery, which I think Sebastian Bach put together for the conference brochure. And it is very, very indicative of the movies of that time in the 60s and the images of rotating computer tapes and huge computers. In 1968, another low-budget film, which you probably never saw, and maybe you won't ever want to see, Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women. Featured men in spacesuits and these very complex-looking rocket ship control panels. This would have just made me drool as a child to see such a thing. And here in the background is again the same giant walls of displays. Interestingly enough, the prehistoric women did not need all this mechanical equipment because they could communicate telepathically. They were very intuitive and had much better communication going on among themselves than the men who needed all of this equipment. Now, let's look at some more recent cinema and HCI issues. Again, think about who are the users, the kind of control panels which inevitably are shown, culture diversity, and especially even species diversity of users. The same thing I said before, information visualization, gesture, audio, the look of the future, the look towards the past, masculine and feminine issues, people versus machine issues, positive and negative issues of technology. So, do you recognize this image? Sure you do. Very influential, Star Wars. In 1977, when it first came out, it was such a hit, such a change. One of the big changes that George Lucas introduced was dirty rockets. Things were dirty. They were bent. They were not new and fresh and sparkling and clean, like everything we saw in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. This was kind of a real-life, nitty-gritty view of technology. I must say, George Lucas was incredibly creative in storytelling, in characters, in his devotion to movie making and the skills required for computer graphics, simulations. But he was not very devoted to HCI. Let me tell you what you probably have already noticed. HCI is not too important for Hollywood or Bollywood or most movie making. The movies are about other things. Oh yes, they have to have some control panels and communicate somehow. And they call in some people to advise them. I don't know who these people are. But sometimes they're not very good at what they're doing. Other times they're somewhat creative. the main creation, I thought, of Star Wars was the lightsaber. You can't get any more potent phallic symbol than that in movie making. And there was a bit of mind control of objects, telekinetic control, but most of the rockets controls, the dashboards and so on, are very conventional for a time so far into the future. Another series that was influential, I think, for many people was the Terminator series. Now, I have to say this seemed a little more creative in providing information display which Der Arnold would see as the robot's creature to detect life forms, to get information about what to do and not to do. And that kind of heads-up display I thought was interesting and somewhat novel for the filmmaking. But again, it was only a part of the total movie. Star Trek, which was supposed to take place in 2366 and started appearing in 1966, was also quite influential. It had multi-cultural crews, all using the same kinds of equipment. There was a very strong orientation to voice communication, although they did have interesting visual displays on a lot of their portable technology. The voice communicator was so well-known and popular that it influenced other movies like Galaxy Quest, if you happen to know that kind of comedy, science fiction movie, which was charming, and also used some kind of portable communicator. So these films did do some innovation in HCI, again, more oriented to voice as far as I noticed. You remember this scene? 2001? Hal, the robot in the background, is not only understanding speech, he's reading their lips. HCIs that can do lip reading. It was a clever innovation. Actually, there are many innovations in 2001, which I think has been claimed by some people to be one of the best movies ever made. It had minimum of a dialogue. It had a lot of displays of data, lots of multiple displays, even HCI jokes. Where have you seen a joke about an HCI in a movie? Do you remember this scene when a man is having to go to use the toilet and he has to read through all these instructions? His spacesuit would be wet by the time he finished reading the instructions. Notice this meeting room. There are no PCs or desktops. This is actually a meeting of people talking to each other. How strange a vision for the future. Here is another interesting defect. There's no concept of mobile phones in 2001. Well, we had mobile phones, but they didn't think about that in 1968. This man is using kind of a payphone with AT&T to call back to Earth. And it even tells him how much it's going to cost. Here are some more scenes featuring many of the more conventional sorts of displays, but at least there were many HCI displays appearing in the movie. Even a tabletop display, you see, like Microsoft's table now, 40 years later or 50 years later, appearing while they ate their food. They could see some information or news. I'm sure many of you recognize this image from the Tron series. The original Tron appeared in 1982, and reappeared in 2010 with some of the same people. Interestingly enough, Tron also did not have much HCI innovation, not even in scenes of displays. There was quite a lot of attention given to a Unix display of some kind when the hero wants to go back into the world of the game of Tron in order to interact with the other characters in the display. But for the most part, there's not a great deal of emphasis. I don't know if you recognize this image. It comes from one of my favorite movies, which is Brazil by Terry Gilliam in 1985. What is remarkable about it is that it has a lot of HCI interaction. It's clumsy, it's atavistic, it's based on 1930s technology, but it's supposed to be somehow in the future or in a fantasy world. Instead of large screen displays, there are just magnifying glasses in front of small screens. This is a phone with connections which you put together with buttons. There are wires and tubes everywhere. This is a fantastic typing assistant device used by one of the secretaries. Gilliam and his crew were incredibly inventive about crazy HCI techniques, some of them totally absurd, but at least they were thinking about them very distinctly and creatively. Now here's a human-machine interaction that I think will stay with us for a long time. Some of you may remember this unforgettable scene when Arnold sticks something up his nose to remove a little ball that's been tracking him on a GPS system. Total Recall of 1990 had also quite a lot of technical innovation, very memorable scenes of devices like this memory replacer, a woman doing gymnastics with a virtual athletic guide, a physical suit of something that fits around the hero's head. And by the way, this is a Philip K. Dick story. Philip K. Dick's science fiction features prominently in a number of different movies. Large-scale X-ray views of people, and surprisingly, so funny, the hero checks into a hotel in the future and they still have old-fashioned PC screens at the desk. They hadn't bothered to innovate there. Here's another very memorable scene of human-computer interaction, which I'm sure many of you know. This is from the Matrix trilogy. The Wachowski brothers, beginning in 1999, produced this series, which featured, among other things, pills to take you from the real world into another world. There was a fascination with multiple displays of information, so many that I imagine it's quite absurd to think that anyone could keep track of all of that. At least I think so. And this wonderful image of dripping letters, sort of like flowing binary code. I used to read hexadecimal printouts from computers in the 1960s, and this is sort of like looking at those priestly writings of that time, only more dynamically. This all in contrast to the strange worlds which are empty of technology, and even in the virtual world, they have to use a telephone to call back into the other worlds. A very kind of simple-minded approach. The one interesting thing influenced by cyberpunk science fiction was plugging in to the central nervous system through the neck, which we'll find in this next film as well. Do any of you know this film? Which? Existence by David Cronenberg. And I thought it was quite a remarkable creation. Again, it's a video game world like Tron as a basis, but the most amazing thing about it is the biomorphic technology. It's bloody HCI. Have you ever thought about such a thing? I hadn't until I saw the movie. I was kind of astounded by it. The people are actually, besides plugging in through holes in the back and using strange organic things to touch and to move and press buttons on, they're actually growing body parts or new HCI components. And at one point in the film, a man is eating a meal, and out of the bones that are left on his plate, he suddenly realizes he can put them together, and the teeth from the animal go into the cartridge holder, and it becomes a gun, and he shoots and kills the person who served him the food, I think. That's the story. Anyway, the idea of constructing equipment out of organic body parts like this was, I thought, really quite amazing. Strangely enough, Jude Law also features in this movie. Now let's look at some 21st century modern sci-fi. Again, think about these issues that I've talked about before. I'll mention a few of them. These themes that can be considered, I've shown them before, we'll see them again in our remaining time. I'm sure you know Tom Cruise, Dancing with Data. This was a very innovative moment in sci-fi film making, simply from using gesture language. Another innovation which has stayed with us in many films since then is the use of transparent displays. Now personally, I can't imagine how useful it is to anyone to be able to see all this information backwards, except maybe to view the person's face in case you want to look at him from a nearby desk. The people don't really play with the notion of what could appear on the back side of an interface in three-dimensional space or a screen display. Because you could see code over here, for example, or maybe nothing, or some pretty picture. Maybe it would be itself transparent to look back and not have the view obstructed by the person you're looking at. Heads-up displays are very useful in jet fighter cockpits, in vehicle displays, and so on. Or for Arnold Schwarzenegger walking around as a robot who needs to see a lot of information in augmented reality environments. It makes sense. But the uses of it sometimes by the TV and movie people seem absurd, at least to me. Now here's another hand gesture challenge. What happens if your feet are also hands? Do you know this image? Good. Oh, there's so many experts in the audience. Ian Flux from about 2005, and it's supposed to show the world after a virus starts poisoning people in 2011. And it contains also quite a number of creative thinking about HCI. Skin displays, for example, raised bumps on the skin as maps. Interestingly, this is not input, it's only output, at least from what I recall in the movie. And Charlize Theron replaces one of her eyeballs by a camera so that she can transmit data. She has these little objects that are spies or agents that she whistles to communicate with, which I thought was kind of creative. And this kissing scene allows this man to deposit a pill of some kind in her mouth, and then she has a drug-induced, I guess, chemical connection to some virtual space where she communicates with the leaders or other people in her group. So those were some of the innovations. Here's a scene which is really HCI center. And do you happen to know this film? You probably know it, Ultraviolet from 2006. And it was originally, I think, animation, turned into a film starring Mila Jovovich. You may know her from The Fifth Element, where she saved the world and the film. In this movie, they have a number of creative innovations like paper telephones, which you use and throw away. I thought that was quite clever. Some interesting facial displays and transparent displays. Use of they bothered to create an artificial language, which is used in some of the signs. And this was, I think this was a building control center that she had to manipulate, or someone had to manipulate to get into to a building, if I remember correctly. Anyone know this one? Thank you. Idiocracy. One of my favorite movies, but I tell you, it's very funny. It's also appalling and disgusting and scary because it shows user interface design for very dumb, stupid, illiterate people, which everyone in the US has become by the year 2506. But they take time to show how advertising, usually for sex or hedonism, will take over all of the displays. The keyboards have to be so simple, no one can read much anymore. News anchors, I think maybe they're both without clothes, I don't know. And the President of the United States speaks at meetings with a machine gun. It's scary, but it also shows some very innovative thinking about dumbing down a user interface for the people. Here's a user interface for very smart people. You probably know Avatar from 2009, featuring the world of 2150. This is, again, a world of men, of metal, of destruction, against the blue people, female-oriented, with connections that don't involve the technology which the men from Earth have. It also features, again, huge numbers of transparent displays which Hollywood seems to be in love with. But it is interesting in terms of some of the information displayed. I want to not run over the time too much, although maybe we started a few minutes late. I'll try to end quickly. Do some of you know this film? District 9. I thought it was quite inventive. It was produced on a very low budget, shot in South Africa, in the slums of South Africa, and features these cockroach aliens from outer space who are parked over Johannesburg in a giant rocket ship and living in a segregated camp, as black people did in South Africa decades ago. If you see the movie, I would recommend this. Pay very careful attention to one or two scenes in which the alien finally gets to go back into his rocket ship, and he begins to manipulate his or her controls. It is so beautiful. Tom Cruise is clumsy in comparison to a three-fingered alien, I think, manipulating the various touch and virtual controls of this spaceship. I don't know who invented or designed it, but it is ballet. It is beautiful. It is a symphony compared to Tom's simple dancing in Minority Report. Also, this human being, the star of the hero of the story, sits down into an alien ship and begins to try to control it. What a challenge of user-centered design. That you could design something for human beings that maybe a three-fingered alien who looks like a giant cockroach could also manipulate? Hard to believe, but if it was designed by this other alien society so smart, maybe it was so intelligent in terms of user-centered design that it could modify itself so that some human being would also be able to manipulate the controls. I don't know exactly what they were thinking about their philosophy of user-centered design, but I suspect they weren't thinking too much. So it's not only Hollywood and Bollywood who have a limited understanding of user-centered design. Even some of the futurists from technology sometimes make some mistakes. Maybe some of you remember Apple's Knowledge Navigator from 1992. It featured a little avatar of Steve Jobs talking in natural language. It was quite controversial at the time because Apple marketing people were using pictures of this non-existent computer in the advertising to convince people to buy Apple computers. And some people said, that's not ethical. You're never going to deliver this, maybe in 20 years, but no one will be able to get this now. It had some interesting ideas about natural language understanding, but even the experts knew this is beyond anything we can do for 5 to 10 years, and Apple's showing it to the public now. AT&T created these demos to show flexible extended surfaces in 1993 for some of their advertising and demos and promotion. I don't know if any of you ever saw this particular image. It comes from the US Defense Department. They actually hired Bryan Singer, who is a well-known Hollywood director, to make a little movie for the Defense Department to show the world of the future of augmented cognition. And this was made and shown in about 2005. It featured terrible typography, a very clumsy layout, ridiculous vertical typography. It's kind of embarrassing in terms of even just typographic legibility and readability, but it was an impressive amount of money spent on a technology demo. Another thing to consider is that I've only shown you movies from Europe and North America, right? What's going on in the rest of the world? What about India and China? Even now, Hollywood knows that most of their money is made overseas. A lot of nations and cultures are rising up and saying, wait a minute, that's enough Hollywood. And we have our own traditions and backgrounds. We have our own heroes and religions and literature. And in fact, in India, there have been sci-fi films since 1952. Have any of you ever seen them? I myself, unfortunately, have not, but I did find these references on the web to many, many authors and films in a variety of languages, because as you may know, India has 14 national languages. So some may be in Gujarati, some in Hindi, Telugu, and so on. And what about China? Another major creation of a middle class who watch movies. They have been importing Jules Verne stories since the late 19th century, as we saw the French do also at that time. There have been a number of Chinese science fiction writers, and some of these have actually been turned into movies. I will be very surprised if any of you recognize this film. Anyone? This is Death Ray on Coral Island by Hong and Jen in 1980. Once again, it features sort of 1960s televisions and very typical controls of decades earlier, but it is an example of trying to deal with command and control and communication. There's another movie called Raise the Red Lantern, which has been cited as almost a Chinese science fiction-like film because it creates an alternate world of people and historical events. So, we've, in a very short time, looked at 100 years of science fiction movies and a little bit of video, mostly from North America and Europe. I've made references to India and China, I learned recently that there's a sci-fi group in Japan that started to look at HCI and sci-fi. And it may be that there are other movements in Europe and North America that I'm not aware of, but would welcome learning more about. Most of these films have demonstrated a little knowledge of user-centered design, but often seemingly not very much. They create their images and their sets for general effect. It would be of interest to see more people like yourself go to Hollywood or Bollywood, or Hong Kong, or Tokyo, and try to influence some of these movie makers to pay more attention to HCI issues and to actually provide a more user-centered design, in some ways a more humane or human-centered approach to the world of the future. At the very least, I think there's a lot to analyze for specifics about the history of the future as envisioned by these films. I haven't organized them by themes, by particular technologies, the use of gesture languages, and so on. But you could study this further. I think you would have a lot of fun, contribute to our general knowledge of HCI, and explore this world of sci-fi and Chi in the future. Vielen Dank. Live long and prosper.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I quite feel like leaving the conference and going to the next seminar. Wir sind schon etwas fortgeschritten in der Zeit. Ich will trotzdem, wenn noch Fragen sind, doch die eine oder andere zulassen, bevor wir uns in die Pause verabschieden. Nur vorab, Markus ist heute hier, er wird uns die Konferenz über begleiten, heutigen Tag bis zum Abendessen. Er wird sich allerdings um 9 Uhr dann verabschieden müssen, um nach Indien weiterzufliegen. Von daher besteht natürlich auch eine Gelegenheit, den nächsten Tag über mit ihm zu sprechen. Are there any questions right now that just can be answered?
Thanks, great talk. Aaron, as always, had a lot of possibilities to some of your keynote talks. If you would have the chance to direct a sci-fi movie today, what would be the main HCI idea that you want to promote?
That is a very good and tricky question. I haven't had time to imagine a fantasy future in which Steven Spielberg calls me up and says, "Hey, can you come and advise me on the next film?" But that's really good. I've always been very influenced by Werner Vinge. Do you know his book, True Names? I suggest you try to find this book because he is one of the first cyberpunk science fiction writers to talk about plugging in and so on. If all of the physical apparatus disappears because we have direct connection between one human being and computer networks and services and other human beings, somewhat like Matrix, what survives of HCI? If we don't have keyboards, we don't need microphones, we don't have physical objects or telephones to talk in, because I can, in a sense, communicate to all of you directly, mentally, or something filtered through Cisco or AT&T or something. So what remains of the user interface, or HCI? My answer is ritual. What HCI is a kind of tribal ritual that we undergo. We know how to say hello and say goodbye, how to connect to data, search for data, get entertainment, get access to large amounts of information, pose a query, review the results. But if the physical apparatus disappears, and maybe I'm just seeing right now information which maybe you can see, maybe only I can see, then we have to ask, how do we dance with data? What kind of rituals would there be for saying hello and goodbye or connecting with people? And Werner Vinge explores that in 3 names. So it really connects the most advanced technology and HCI conceptions to our civilization 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, 50,000 years ago. And that is a very, very intriguing connection to bring time around to connect again. So that's what I would probably want to talk about. Okay.
Another question?
They may want coffee.
So there's plenty of time today. There's just one thing I have to, not to ask, but to give you a little present for you coming to Chemnitz. It's a so-called Rahamandel. It's a Saxonian tradition. A little figure, smoking figure.
It is Saxon mobile. I thought it might be a Barbie doll, but... wunderbar. So, I want to introduce you to my new avatar mini-me.
Thank you for coming to Chemnitz. Ladies and gentlemen, Aaron Marcus.